Good evening, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Jillian Cantor in conversation with Tammy Greenwood. My name is Jamie Madsen. I'll be your host for the evening, and I just have a couple of quick notes. The format will feature between 40 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. For any questions or comments that pop up, please go ahead and submit them under the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And also keep an eye on your chat box tonight. I will be sharing discount codes and other goodies for you. And now I'm really thrilled to introduce tonight's author. Jillian Cantor has a BA in English from Penn State University and an MFA from the University of Arizona. She is the author of award-winning and best-selling novels for teens and adults, including Margot, In Another Time, and Half-Life. Born and raised in a suburb of Philadelphia, Cantor currently lives in Arizona with her husband and two sons. And in conversation with Jillian is Tammy Greenwood, the author of 13 award-winning novels. She lives in San Diego, where she teaches creative writing and spends her summers in her home state of Vermont. Her next novel, Such a Pretty Girl, will be published in November. So they are with us tonight to discuss Jillian's new title, Beautiful Little Fools, which I cannot stop gushing about. I loved it so much. So on that note, let's hand it straight over to you, Tammy. Want to get us started?
Great. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So she was gushing about the book, and I was thinking earlier, it was like, authors think of books as like their children or their babies, and I feel like this is my little niece because I was there, from when you first started thinking about it, and then through the process of you writing it. And I get really fortunate that you shared it with me back in 2020 when it was like a fledgling
tiny baby.
Tiny baby. And now all I can do is like brag about it like I had something to do with it.
No, you did. You read it really early, I remember. And then you gave me some feedback on it too. So you did. You were like a little ant.
Wow, I'm very proud of you, and I'm very proud of proud of her. So Beautiful Little Fools is taken from a line in The Great Gatsby, which is the book that this book is based on. It's like I don't know how I'll let you describe it more, but basically, it's a re-envisioning of The Great Gatsby. So why don't you talk a little bit about exactly what it is that you've done with this book so that people can understand, what the story is.
Sure. So Beautiful Little Fools, which I'm going to hold it up because I have it, is a reimagining of the world of The Great Gatsby, but it's from the women's points of view. And it's sort of part retelling of a classic, part mystery, and part historical novel imagining the lives of women at this time. And it takes place before, during, and after the original Great Gatsby. The original is set just the summer of 1922. My novel spans 1917 to 1923. And there's a detective character who's investigating Jay Gatsby's death. He's murdered at the end of The Great Gatsby, but my detective thinks that his murder isn't as simple as we always might have thought, and he suspects one of three women might have been responsible. So we see these three women's stories unfold over a span of 5 years leading up to and after the murder, and it's a mystery in its own right. I don't think you have to have read The Great Gatsby to even, understand or get Beautiful Little Fools. But I think if you have read The Great Gatsby, or a little bit about The Great Gatsby, you would definitely get a deeper understanding of it.
Yeah. So do you remember the first time that you read The Great Gatsby?
I do. I was in high school in an English class, and I can't remember if it was 10th or 11th grade. I was trying to figure this out, but it was one of those 2 years. And it was the first classic novel that I was assigned to read in high school that I just really loved and wanted to read. And then I read it again in college in a class, and I kept my college copy. I still have it on my desk.
Oh, cool.
Moved it with me across the country. It's like sat in the front of like my bookshelf with my favorite books for years. And I would pull it out every year or two and reread it again. And I think initially I really loved it as a reader, when I was a teenager and I read it, and I loved every sentence is so beautiful, but it recreates or like shows such a vivid portrait of this tiny slice of American life, the roaring 20s, but also it just has this like crazy plot with affairs and murder and glamour and drinking and prohibition and partying. And so I really was drawn to it as a reader. Then later I came back to it as a writer, and I always loved the choice that F. Scott Fitzgerald made to narrate the whole book from Nick's point of view. And I'm always really fascinated in point of view as a writer, thinking about how the person who narrates any particular story kind of colors that story just, by who they are and how they see the world. So I was always really fascinated with the fact that Fitzgerald chose the outsider to narrate the story and didn't choose one of the people within the story. And so I love examining as a writer to see how he did that too.
So how did you choose the women to give a voice to? Because we get some expected ones like Daisy and Jordan, but then we also get Myrtle's sister, which is not, I don't know that if I were doing the same project that I would have been like, oh, I'm going to do this. So how did you arrive at the POV, and including the detective? How did you arrive at who was going to tell the story?
So, initially I had the idea to reimagine the Great Gatsby, but from Daisy's point of view. So that was sort of like my initial thought. But then I really love Jordan. Daisy's best friend in the book, Jordan, has sort of always been my favorite character. So then I was like, well, I want it to be Daisy and Jordan's story. But then I started to think about the fact that I wanted it to be a murder mystery. And so then I had a detective character who I thought of, and he's the only one who was not in the original novel, who's a point of view character. He's totally created for me. And I wanted Myrtle's storyline to come in. Myrtle is Tom's mistress, Daisy's husband's mistress. And she's also murdered in The Great Gatsby. But I didn't want her to be a point of view character because I knew she got murdered. And so I was like, well, she couldn't have killed Jay Gatsby. She's dead. So I reread The Great Gatsby, and they mention her sister twice in The Great Gatsby. She's in 2 scenes. She's 2 tiny mentions. All we know about her is that she's Myrtle's younger sister. She has a red bob. She's in the party scene at Myrtle's apartment where Tom punches her in the nose and breaks her nose. And then later in the book, after Myrtle dies, she identifies her body and like lies to the detectives and says that there was nothing going on. She has no idea why anyone would hit Myrtle with a car, which is not true. Mm-hmm. So we knew barely anything about her. So she was very attractive as a character to me for that reason. I could give her a window into Myrtle's story and she could share more about Myrtle, but also I had a lot of leeway to make her up. And I made her a suffragette, and she's, very feminist for the time. And I felt like I had a lot of space to do that. Whereas Daisy and Jordan, we know a lot about them from the novel. And I tried to stay true to them to a certain point. Because I wanted it to sort of work as a companion to The Great Gatsby. Whereas if you read The Great Gatsby and then you read my book, you could see how my characters could fit right into that same space.
Right. So basically what you have is the first, 2/3 of the novel is kind of a prequel. It's everything leading up to the summer that is the heart of The Great Gatsby. And so I'm curious how you reverse engineered The Great Gatsby to move backward in time. Did you do each individual story for each of these women and their histories and move backward, to where it began? Or what was your process for doing that? Because it's not like history, I mean, it is. It's fictional history. Right?
Yeah. I did it kind of similarly to how I would do actual history, which I've written about real people before. And so I sort of went about it in the same way, where I went through the original Great Gatsby. And even though that takes place just over 3 months in the summer of 1922, they do talk about where everyone was and what they were doing in the 5 years prior. So I sort of pieced together what everyone's timeline would be based on what we know from the Great Gatsby. And I made a timeline for everyone first. And Daisy and Jordan, we know where they were from 1917 through 1922. Catherine, I invented a little bit. We know she's in New York by the summer of 1922, but I gave her own timeline. So I actually made a big outline before I started. And I don't normally outline when I write. I normally, like people always ask writers if we're a pantser or a plotter. And I always say that I'm a pantser which means I'm just like going by the seat of my pants and making it up as I go along. But I was actually a plotter for Beautiful Little Fools for the first time. And it was because I did need to reverse engineer from the book, like you said. So I made a big timeline of where everyone was, and that turned into an outline, which went chapter by chapter, sort of saying what each character would be doing in each chapter and each year. And I knew that the detective was going to come in just a few times, but I had him pop in sort of when the years switched over for the women. So I think he comes in like 5 times,
Okay.
or maybe 6 times. So I had that outline and then I went from there.
That's great. And one of my favorite things that you do with this, and this is for fans of The Great Gatsby like I am, is there are lines that are taken directly from the original. And that's the beautiful thing of having the book in the public domain now, right? Is that
Yes.
you can sort of weave in the fictional language of the characters speaking and some of the dialogue. And I've seen both of the movies, and I remember, do you have a preference for which movie you like better, the new version or the old Robert Redford one?
Well, there's actually a third little known movie.
Oh, wow.
That I discovered. It was I had to like order the DVD from I don't know, I found it online somewhere, like a used like DVD site. It was only on DVD, it wasn't streaming, but Paul Rudd plays Nick. And that was like my favorite version, because of course anything Paul Rudd does I love, but he was a really good
Who's Daisy in that?
Oh my gosh, I forget off the top of my head. Mira Sorrino, maybe. I'd have to look it up. Now I'm going to say the wrong thing, but I'll have to email you. But Paul Rudd, I just like stood out. He was a great Nick. So I think that was actually my favorite version.
Well,
and then
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I love, the newer version just because it's like so visually spectacular. But the Robert Redford one also holds a special place in my heart.
Well, I was thinking about the scene, the party, or at the hotel, the scene when they're before the accident.
Yeah, at the plaza, they're all drinking.
Yeah, at the plaza, and and it's so hot. And the thing that I appreciated in the Robert Redford version is like they're sweating. I don't know what the director did, but like they're all like glistening. And that, if you've ever been in New York in August, it's like that, and it just captures that. So, these beautiful people in their beautiful clothes, and they are just like shimmering with heat. And I thought that was amazing. But I probably more a lot of the dialogue I remember from the film, and so it's like, I would recognize a line here or there, and it's fine because you feel like it's like a little puzzle, like, ooh, that's really in the book. This is exactly the way it went in the story.
There are, I did actually end up using, some lines from the story. And that was another thing I sort of mapped out before I started. And there are lines here and there where the characters will say like, oh, well, when this happened, I said this. And so then I actually created that scene. Like Daisy tells Nick, her cousin Nick, she says, well, when my baby was born, I wished he would be a boy. And then when they told me it was a girl, I said, I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. So in The Great Gatsby, she's telling that to Nick in the summer of 1922. But in my book, you actually see the scene where she has her baby and she says that. So that was kind of fun to do stuff like that. And then there's one line of Jordan's that really sort of unlocked her whole story for me. And it's in that plaza scene that you were just talking about, where it's so hot. And they start talking about Daisy and Tom's wedding. And then they start talking about how it was so hot, someone fainted. And then Jordan speaks up and she says, we carried him down the street to my house because I lived just 2 doors down. And then she said, he stayed with us for 3 weeks. And then daddy kicked him out. And then he died the next day. And then I was like, wait, her father died and he kicked this man out. And so I like figured out sort of her whole storyline based on this, this one little line. And she does still say that line in my book, but it means something totally different because you know what happened with this man and with her father.
Bloxy.
Yeah. Bloxy.
Bloxy.
Yeah. So there were, and actually that scene they talk, they have a lot of little mentions that come back in my book, where Daisy tells Tom, I never loved you. And he says, not even in Capiolani. And then you see that scene when they're in Capiolani in my book.
The honeymoon.
So I definitely mined that, scene and thought, all right, well, I'm going to show what they're talking about here.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's go back to the line that your title is taken from, which is for me the most heartbreaking line. And even when I read it in high school, I remember, thinking, like, sitting in my literature class, being an aspiring writer back then, thinking, wow, that breaks my heart. That breaks my heart that a woman would prefer her daughter to be a fool at this time, because it's, then she's too stupid to know
Right.
how hard and cruel the world is. So I was curious about you've obviously chosen to tell this story from the female points of view for a reason. And I thought you did a really beautiful job of showing the difficulties that women faced at this time, the sort of yearning and longing that was, for something impossible, which is, freedom and independence. And but I love the characters because each of them sort of are seeking out the same thing. To me, anyway, it felt like, they all wanted autonomy. And so if you could just talk a little bit about, not what your agenda was, but, what arose thematically in terms of these female characters, and showing, if you look at this as sort of a feminist retake on Gatsby.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a feminist retake on Gatsby. And that line always stuck out to me too, from the very first time that I read it. When I started to think about things from Daisy's point of view, I think the first thing I thought was, does she really think that she wants her daughter to be a fool, or does Nick think that she really wants that? Like, was she saying it sarcastically, or did she really believe that? And I never thought that Daisy was as much of a fool as the men thought that she was, and I felt like once we delved into her thoughts and her head, we would kind of see things differently. I understand why she says that though, because when she has her daughter, I mean, she gets pregnant on their honeymoon and Tom cheats on her honeymoon, which she finds out when he gets into a car accident with the maid at their hotel, like on their honeymoon. And then she finds out she's pregnant, I think the next day. And so I think she was in this like sort of bad state when she has the daughter, where she feels like sort of helpless and trapped in this relationship. So I imagine that she was sort of saying it almost in the heat of the moment, but I didn't really think that she was a fool. And I wanted to kind of portray that in her character for sure. And you're right, like Catherine, I think most of all expresses sort of this feminist vision. And like I said, I had the most room to play around with Catherine since she wasn't that much of a character in the book. And she moves to New York in her very first chapter in 1917. And when she gets off the train, she says something like, a woman could be someone in New York, not someone's wife, but someone. And that is her goal. She does not want to be a wife. She wants to be a person. And I think that's all of the women's goals in my book.
Well, and you have Jordan, who's an athlete and, has no desire for a husband.
Yeah, and that was actually pretty true to her original character, which is why I think I was always drawn to her. She is a golfer and Nick kind of courts her, but she's not super interested in Nick in the original. I think Nick's much more interested in her. And there is a little rumor that there's a scandal with the golf tour in the original. And so I felt like, for a woman at that time, like Jordan was pretty strong. She had a career and she didn't really want Nick.
Right. Yeah. And I think, the look at, I think Gatsby is often misread as sort of a love story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you re-examine the relationship between Gatsby and Daisy. And, it's sort of a different perspective on what that means, because we're getting it from her point of view, but it's sort of a love affair that, a teenage romance, right? That she had.
And I think the first time I read it in high school, I did read it as a love story, like a tragic love story. It was probably the same year I read Romeo and Juliet. And it was sort of this, the same in my mind. It was this like tragic love story. Right. And then when I came back to Gatsby as an adult, I didn't see it as a love story at all. And when you think of it from Daisy's point of view, I mean, from Nick's point of view, which we see in the original, he's very enamored with Gatsby and he sees it as a love story and he presents it to us this way. And I think we're seeing it through his sort of like rose-colored glasses. But as soon as I thought about it from Daisy's point of view, which I started to do when I reread the book as an adult, it's like this man she dated 5 years earlier who she broke up with. He like intentionally moves across the sound from her new house just so he can stare at her, and then has parties to try to get her attention. It just felt so stalkery. And he's like weirdly aggressive with her in the book. And Nick describes it in a way where it's like, oh, they were so in love. But if you actually look at the actions that are happening and think about what it would be like to be a woman on the receiving end of them, I felt uncomfortable for Daisy.
Yeah. And I think that's depicted so beautifully. You're never rooting, when you read your book, you're never rooting for Daisy and Gatsby to be together, because it's not, it's not this sort of ill-timed love affair that sort of gets presented in the original, at least via Nick. And I don't know what Fitzgerald was, what his commentary was. He may have very well been like, look at this stalker.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, Nick is his own character and is super interesting. And I think it makes sense with what we know about Nick that he sees it that way. But that's like the beauty of switching point of view. It's like a different character could see the same exact thing completely different. And that's what's so interesting.
I actually thought about that. I reread it just this last weekend and was thinking about the depiction of Nick, because, I always use Gatsby as an example when I'm teaching point of view to talk about, a point of view that is not one of the main characters. It's sort of this, it's this secondary character telling the story of the, hero of the story or whatever. But I started thinking about your depiction of Nick, and he's sort of this milquetoast kind of like, kind of dullard. And I hadn't thought about that before, because he's sort of in the shadows, in a way in Gatsby, the story, he's sort of the observer.
He is. He's kind of quiet, and he's like kind of going along with everything. And a lot of what we're seeing in The Great Gatsby is like in his interior space. Right. But the other characters don't know that, they're not hearing his thoughts that we hear in the original. Right.
No, yeah, it was really interesting. I loved to, and I hadn't thought about that the first time I read your book. I hadn't really thought about Nick so much, the depiction of Nick. But it was really cool to kind of get we had to have him, like we had to see him, in this story as well, since he plays such a big role. Let me see. I guess maybe just talk about some general questions about your process. I know because you write a lot of historical fiction, and people are always interested in your routine and things like that. And did it differ for this book, or was it pretty par for the course?
Yeah, I mean, it actually did differ a lot for this book, because I wrote it largely during the very beginning of the pandemic. And I had written the first 50 pages in that like detailed outline that I mentioned in January of 2020. And then I sold it to my editor just on that much in February of 2020. I think it was like February 25th, 2020 or something. And my deadline to turn the first draft of the book in was July 1st, I believe. So, February 25th, 2020, I was like, oh, I have all this time. I have an outline. I'm going to just leisurely write while my kids are at school. And then within like a week, I was, aware that was not going to happen. And at first I took 2 weeks off from writing, because remember, we all thought we were only going to need 2 weeks and then we were going to be fine. Yeah, flatten the curve, just 2 weeks. So I didn't write for 2 weeks. And then it became clear to me that things were not going back to normal. My kids were going to be home for the rest of the year. I wasn't leaving the house, and I had to write this book. So normally I'm like pretty regimented in my schedule, and I'll write when my kids are at school, like I'll drop them off, I'll have coffee, I'll write from like 8 to 2. And then that's my writing time. But I didn't have to go anywhere. In April and May of 2020, my kids didn't go to school. They were doing school from their room, and I didn't really even have to get out of bed at 5:30 a.m. like I normally do. So I just sort of had this like endless day where I didn't have a schedule. And at first I struggled with it a little bit. And I always try to get myself to write, like I'll give myself a goal for the day, like 1,000 words or 2,000 words or 5 pages or something. So I was in that stage because I was drafting the book, but I was like really struggling. And just like unable to write at first. And then I realized that I was actually really productive between the hours of like 3 p.m. and 7 p.m., which is when I would never normally write, because it would always be a time when I was like picking kids up from school and driving to activities and making dinner. But since I had nowhere to go, I was writing during that time. So I wrote the majority of the book between 3 and 7 every day during the pandemic. And also I found, if I wasn't done for the day, I didn't have to like stop to go pick someone up from school. I could just keep going until I got to the point where I wanted to get to. So it was sort of freeing in that way too. And actually ended up being a really good distraction. It was like April, May, and June of 2020. I was drafting the book. So I was living in Daisy and Jordan's world and not living in our world, which was like very scary at the time. So I was actually really glad that I had it, but my process was definitely different than it normally is.
Yeah, I agree. The same thing happened with me. I wrote Such a Pretty Girl at the same, I think it was over
I
that
remember.
summer. Yeah, and it was similar. And I sought refuge in a world that doesn't exist anymore. Which is 1977 New York City. Which is a time that you could go into and not deal with the pandemic. It's curious though, because I feel like other writers that I know either really really struggled to produce and to create during 2020, or really found refuge in the creativity. And I feel like 2021 I didn't write anything at all, but 2020 I took advantage of the
2021 I was writing something else, but my kids were back at school and I had like more of the schedule, and so I then kind of struggled to get back to that 8 to 2 timeline, because I liked writing later in the day better, but oh well.
And it's interesting that you use the word. I don't think I knew that about you, that you use word count quotas. I do too. I'm like a firm proponent of the word count quota, whatever for the individual writer, but to say I'm going to write 1,500 words a day every day until this thing is
and then
done.
I do like, I'll make like a schedule, like especially for this book, because I had a deadline when I had to turn it in. I think I did 1,500 words a day actually. And so I had like every day on the calendar, and I had like what word count I was going to be at, and then I would cross it off, so it would feel very satisfying, like I was getting something done. And then I never like guessed the word count correctly, so I probably got to the end and I was still going, but I still just felt like I was making progress because I was just picking it off every day.
I think it's the only way that you get things done is by doing it in increments. Do you write 7 days a week?
I don't. I usually just write on weekdays. And I take the weekends off to read and watch TV and just sort of recharge. And sometimes I will, like if I do have a deadline, or if I'm just really immersed in a project, like sometimes I will work a little bit on the weekend, but I really try not to. You do work on the weekends, don't you?
I pretty much work. Well, when I'm in the middle of a book, I write every day. I feel like my habits have gotten a little bit worse in the last year. But
we all.
It's like really good for a long, long time, for like 20 years. But a little pandemic threw things off. But no, I typically do. And when I'm in the middle of I just started writing a book, and I'm like 20,000 words in or whatever, and I totally do the same thing. Like in my planner, I'm like, 1,500 words a day, and I have my tally and I do my checks, and
those are satisfying checks.
They are satisfying checks. And the weekends for me are liberating because I teach during the week. So there's always something like I have student work to read and other things that I have to do with my time. So the weekends are actually time when I don't have other obligations. So I tend to get a little bit more done sometimes on the weekends. And you and I both have teenagers, which is awesome because they sleep, and they aren't up like, little ones are. But I had one other question. So if everything was in the public domain and you had your choice of some sort of, book from our literary past, that you could do this again with and write the sort of, female version, do you have one that you sort of dream of but can't because it's not in the public domain?
So I actually I really wanted to do something with Nancy Drew, but she's actually trademarked. So that's never going to happen. But I felt like that would be so much fun. She was my first fictional feminist heroine, and I
Right.
would like love to reimagine her, but
Yeah.
it's never gonna happen.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough one.
But it would be a really cool book.
It would be. It definitely would be. I think that was all I had. Was there other stuff that you wanted to talk about with the book? Any?
Oh, I think I'm trying to see if we have questions. I'm looking
Oh,
here. If
yeah,
anyone
yeah.
has questions, I think you can put them in the Q&A or the chat. Oh, I think those are coupons in the
All right.
chat. Well, why don't you tell us about your new book, which
I
got
don't have any practice talking about my book.
I know. You can tell us. I'll tell people. I got to read it early, and it's coming out October 26th. I think you said
25th.
Is that right? 25th. Such a pretty girl. And it's I got to read it early and loved it. And it's like you said, it was immersive for you during the pandemic. It was immersive for me to read during the pandemic. It takes place part in the 70s in New York and part in the present-ish day, right? But like before the pandemic.
Yeah. 2019.
2019. Yeah. And it's about, why don't you tell us briefly?
Well, it's about a woman named Ryan Flanagan, who's a former child actress and model. And it's in the present day. She gets a text from her best friend saying that there is a photograph of her from back when she was young. And it's kind of controversial black and white art photograph that was found in the home of a man named Zev Brenner during a raid. And he's sort of an Epstein kind of character. And the worst part is that on the back of this photograph, which she hasn't seen in 40 years or whatever, is an inscription from her mother to this man. And so pulls her out of her little safety bubble that she's made for herself and her teenage daughter in Vermont. And she has to return to New York to contend with her mom. And the book is told in both the past and the present, and everything leading up to, most of it takes place over 1976 and 1977 when she and her mother were living in an artist community in New York called West Beth, which is an actual artist residence that still exists and artists still live there. And while they're living there, it tells the story of everything behind her emerging career and what led up to the night that the photograph was taken, which was during the blackout of 1977. So that's the gist of it. And that's the first time I've ever spouted that off. So it's weird to hear myself talking about it.
And it's so good. And it's about like art and fame and mothers and daughters. And I particularly loved the 1970s era setting. I love that time.
It was
period.
super fun to research. And actually this past summer in 2021, I went to New York and met my agent there, and we like sort of snuck onto West Beth's campus or whatever. It's an old factory building on the in the village, and walked into the little courtyard, and it was so strange because it was like stepping into my book, because I had done all this research but I had never been there, and we were like looking up at the balconies that I'd written about, and it was really cool. So it's exciting, and I've never lived in New York, but I've spent a lot of time there, especially in my adult life, and so it was really fun to kind of I always write about places that I want to spend time, or
and especially during the pandemic when we couldn't really go anywhere. That must have been
exactly. And then and I think that's why we write as well as read, is to sort of get to live these other lives, right? And so that was super fun.
Yeah. And I was in the roaring 20s during the pandemic, and I kept thinking that I knew this book was coming out in 2022. And so I was like, all right, we're going to be in our own roaring 20s by then. Right. So sadly, we're not. Hopefully soon we will be.
That's great. I hadn't even thought about that.
I was hoping.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So what else was I going to ask you? I was going to ask you something else. Do you want to talk about what you're working on or no?
No, I can't really talk about what I'm working on, but I'll just say that I'm working on something and it's sort of another feminist reimagining of a different classic. And hopefully I can talk about it more soon.
Yeah, and which I have not read yet. So I'm really
No, not yet.
I'm really excited.
But you can be an aunt to this one too.
Yes.
There is a question in there now.
Oh, good. Okay.
If you want me to read it. Okay, Alma's wondering, of the three female characters in Beautiful Little Fools, which one did you, one, enjoy writing the most, two, find most difficult to write, and any of the characters surprise you while you were writing the book, question mark.
I think Jordan was my favorite one to write. And I think it was just because I always liked her. I mean, I liked writing all of them. I have to say that. It was really fun. There was never a day when I got up and dreaded writing this book. This was a book that I loved every minute of being in, which doesn't always happen. And Tammy can attest to that too. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. But this book, I did not have that feeling. But Jordan was my favorite. I think I was always the most drawn to her in the original book. But also she's just so tough and so strong. And she has this real vulnerability though beneath the surface that was sort of really fun to get at. So every time I got to write Jordan, I was super excited. I think the hardest was probably Daisy, because Daisy comes across as pretty unsympathetic in the original book, and I really wanted to make her a sympathetic character in my version. I wanted to show that she does these things that maybe come off as unsympathetic, but she has some motivation and some reasons for it. And I gave Daisy a sister in Beautiful Little Fools who did not exist in The Great Gatsby that we know of, because her family's not really mentioned other than that she grew up in Louisville. So I gave her a sister, and that sort of unlocked something for me with her and sort of helped me understand her. And I think the book is also about sisters in a way, sisterhood through friendship, sisters. Daisy has a sister, Myrtle and Catherine are sisters. So that helped me balance her out. And I forgot what the last part of the question was now. Oh, did anything surprise me? I did an outline for the book, like I said, which I don't normally do. And it was very extensive. It was chapter by chapter. So I wrote everything according to my outline, finished my first draft, sent it to my editor, and she read it. And then she called me and she was like, "You're missing the last chapter." And I was like, "No, this is what my outline says. That's the last chapter." And she was like, "But that's not the last chapter." So after we talked it through, I realized she was right. I didn't write an ending for the book. And so that surprised me because I thought I had it all figured out. And then, I did figure it out, and I'm really happy with the ending now. But I think it was interesting because I had never worked that way with an outline before. I think I sort of forgot to have a little bit of creativity at a point too. And I couldn't even see it. I just stuck to the outline. And as soon as she said it, I could see it. And I knew what needed to happen, but initially that final chapter was not in the book.
And the final chapter is so great. It's just so gratifying. So
thanks. Yeah, I was really excited with it once I figured it out, but it took me a few weeks to understand what she was saying to me, because I was just like, no, my outline says.
I'm finished.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so warm and inviting. I really enjoyed hearing about both of your books, and you did a really good job of not giving away too much. I'm telling you guys, it is so good. It's unputdownable. But yeah, we were getting lots of great feedback. People are looking forward to reading both of your books, and a big thank you all around. And yes, to everyone asking, this is being recorded. You will all get an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, the discount code, pretty much everything we touched on tonight. So
awesome. And go shop at your indie bookstores.
Yes, I love indies.
Use those coupons because we need our lovely indie booksellers.
And I forgot to say that Beautiful Little Fools actually was on the indie bestseller list yesterday, and I was so excited and so grateful to all the indie bookstores who are hand selling my book and emailing me, and I have signed copies at my local indies, and I believe you guys have book plates as well. All the stores I'm doing events with, I think, got signed book plates. Hopefully you have them, Jamie. If not, I'll make sure I can send you some more.
Yeah, if not, we moved our warehouse this week, so things have been real a little bit of organized chaos, so they might be somewhere.
Okay, well, I know I sent them, so hopefully they're there, but if not, then email me and I will make sure you get some. So if anybody wants a signed copy, they can contact you to order and I'll send book plates.
That would be lovely. Thanks so much, Jillian. I really enjoyed having you both here tonight, and maybe we can get you back in person later in the year for Tammy's book.
That would be lovely. I hope the pandemic is over by then.
Me too. Oh boy.
Roaring 20s for Tammy's book.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe by the 70s. Well,
the 70s were pretty good too, though.
The 2070s. Maybe by the 2070s we'll be done with.
Oh Thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a really good evening.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Tammy.
Take care. Bye, Jillian.
Bye.
Bye.